Hey everyone, Dr. Adrian Huang back with you. Today we're going to talk to one of my really good friends and colleagues, Dr. Danny Goel. So not only is Dr. Goel a very successful orthopedic surgeon, he is also the CEO of his very own successful startup, a VR company called PrecisonOS, which you may have heard of. So he's going to give us some tips and tricks on how to become a successful surgeon and entrepreneur and how to live your dream life. Danny, thanks so much for joining us today. So the first question for you is, what was your path to becoming an orthopedic surgeon?
So not straightforward. In fact, I was not interested in orthopedics when I first was in medical school. I actually had an affinity for multiple things, including internal medicine, radiology, anesthesia. It wasn't until I met one of my mentors in fourth year, or towards the end of my third year, that I became interested in orthopedics.
Can you tell me more about this mentor? How do they guide you, and what advice did they give you?
Yeah, it was mostly around, so there was several mentors I had before I got into medicine, and I didn't get in the first time I applied to medical school, which is not uncommon actually, but persistence and perseverance won in that scenario. And so when I had my mentor during my pre-medical area, his advice to me was always keep your doors open and keep your options open and explore as much as you can when you get into medicine. And that's the approach that I took. I never set out to be one particular type of physician, but I did know I wanted to be a physician. The mentor I had in orthopedics was really open about, again, exploring other areas. It wasn't very much like, you should do orthopedics. It's, what else have you tried and what do you like about each of those specialties?
Awesome, and that kind of gives you a very well-rounded approach and very kind of holistic approach to medicine, I would imagine.
I found getting into residency to be a really challenging exercise, because you're competing with some of the top medical students around the country. And so back then, which has somewhat changed now because of COVID, it was interview, paper applications, you're FedExing things before a deadline, and you're flying around the country to interview at the most competitive places, and every single person at those interviews is your competition. And back then, and even now, there are certain programs that were much more competitive than others, and everybody wanted a seat at those programs.
Once you got in, and remind us, sorry, where did you do your residency?
University of Calgary.
Oh, University of Calgary,
Yeah.
Nice. And you're from
Winnipeg.
Manitoba.
Yeah.
Winnipeg,
Yeah.
right. Once you got there, did you set out with certain goals in mind, for example, research or innovation or technology?
So I came from a really strong research background because I did my master's degree during medical school and just before that. So I'd already published and I understood what that was like and the commitment that required. And so one of my agendas while a resident was to do research and be an academic, because I found that part interesting. It was an opportunity for me to ask questions and seek out the answers for those questions. And so that was one thing that I drove towards, because I knew it would help me in the future to always be inquisitive. I explored multiple different areas of research. So that was my first time exposed to an economic-based study in medicine. We looked at outpatient Achilles tendon surgery and whether those patients should be admitted or not, and all along to DVT prophylaxis in fracture patients. So it was a myriad of areas, and I just enjoyed having that diversification even to a research background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you eventually chose shoulder and elbow,
right?
And you did a very prestigious fellowship. Did you have this aha moment where you're like, okay, shoulder and elbow is for me?
Very late in my residency, because I actually was very interested in spine as well as hip and knee arthroplasty, and so that carried on towards the end of my residency program, and then I did shoulder towards the end of my fourth year of residency, which is very, very late. And at that point, I decided that I wasn't going to continue on with spine or hip and knee, and actually pursue shoulder.
Well, for one, I'm very happy you made that decision.
Yeah.
That's great to have you as a colleague.
Yeah.
But what was it about shoulder, or what was it? Was it the mentor that you had, or was it the material? What was it that interested you in it?
One of the things I found about shoulder was I liked the idea of doing both arthroscopic and open. That combination was really appealing. The other thing I really enjoyed was the shoulder is as simple or as complex as you want it to be, and I like the complexity of it because it is the most mobile joint in the body, and so the little things that you do have such an impact. And I started, one of my mentors talked about how we live in spheres. So your hand lives in a sphere, your wrist is a bigger sphere, and then your shoulder is the biggest sphere. So I thought, wow, that's a really interesting perspective. So I really enjoyed the upper part of that sphere because I thought it'd provide people the most ability if they were disabled.
So it sounds like you had some great mentors going through, and eventually as I mentioned, you did a very prestigious fellowship with Dr. J.P. Warner.
Right.
Tell me about getting into that fellowship. Did that require a lot of networking? Was it because of you branded yourself as a research person? How did you get into it? And then secondly, what was Dr. Warner like as a mentor for you?
So again, very competitive fellowship. I was one of his additional fellows, so it wasn't again not a direct path for me. But once I got into Dr. Warner's fellowship, he embraces his fellows like something I've never seen before. You become part of his approach and his philosophy, and really he drove that team mentality because he was ultimately responsible for us and the trajectory of our career. And he's the one that introduced me to the idea of starting to think in terms of innovation, because he's been involved in innovation for 25 years. So I started seeing glimpses of that with certain things that he would do on the innovation side, but also things that he would do on the medical side. For example, inviting people from different countries to give talks at North American meetings because they had innovative ideas about the shoulder. And specifically, I'm talking about the French surgeons, Dr. Boileau, Dr. Walsh. And Dr. Gerber is another example, someone from Zurich, who also bring in those innovative ideas to our thinking so we can evolve in our thinking as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, and like you said, the teamwork aspect of it, especially in medicine, is so key.
Critical.
Yeah, critical, absolutely. Yeah. You kind of mentioned the innovation part of it, and so now, in addition to being an orthopedic surgeon, a successful orthopedic surgeon, you are the CEO of a successful startup called PrecisonOS. So first, tell us, how did you make that switch? Was this always something you wanted to do?
So, being someone who is driven by academics, and we can talk a little bit about that at some point, but, it's the idea that academic surgeons have to live in an academic center is what I really thought I was going to do. And at that time, there was no job available in a quote-unquote academic center. And so that was very frustrating for me, and I spoke to my mentor, Dr. Warner, at the time, and he said something to me very, very powerful. He says, academics, or specifically academia, is a state of mind. It's not an institution. And I took that and I ran with that because I work at a smaller hospital. I have fantastic colleagues, and it's probably the best place that I know that I'm fortunate enough to work. But I took that mentality and I ran with that, and I kept, again, my doors open, which was just keeping in touch with what was happening around me and seeing if there was something I could build on. So I created my own research program. I started doing academics. I would go away from my practice to go and learn from other specialists. So I brought different things like tendon transfers back to Vancouver. I did the first superior capsule reconstruction in BC, or the first lower trap transfer, because I spent time at the Mayo Clinic. So that thinking really helped me on that innovation side. And then as soon as I saw what we're going to talk about next on the VR side, I knew this was a path I had to go down.
It's amazing because those things you talk about, superior capsular reconstructions, lower trapezius transfers, for us in upper extremity orthopedics, these are kind of staples of our toolbox. So, having you being the first person to do them in Vancouver is actually pretty special and pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So, in terms of now having being in that startup sphere as a CEO, what kind of traits from medicine did you bring over, or what did you have to learn new?
So the traits that have carried me through medical school that are really relevant now are humility. That's perhaps the biggest one. An openness to listen to others. That's relevant every day, both in practice as well as in the startup. And one of the things that really was important with innovation is trying to understand how people think and make decisions. And I think that relies on you being sensitive to being open to their feedback and actually being able to tolerate if they say something negative about your product. And I think that's a really big thing, because not everybody's going to like what you build, and they're not going to believe you. Which is, if you're thinking about building, a product that everybody's going to use in the world and benefit from, when someone tells you they don't like it, it's a big sting. And so you really have to tolerate that, and you have to learn from that. So accepting and motivating yourself through failure is a really, really strong and powerful characteristic you have to bring to a startup.
Was it a big learning curve for you to learn some of the business aspects of being a CEO, or did that come naturally?
No, it was a huge learning curve. In fact, I continue to learn. And in fact, when I went down this pathway, one of the things that I did a lot of was a ton of reading. So I ordered some books online about what does it mean to market? What does it mean to have some financial knowledge? What does it mean to build a software company? Who do you need? Who are the key people? Yeah. And surround yourself with those people, because you don't build it by yourself, you build it as a team. And so bringing that team mentality was really important. That's effectively, I think, the continual skills that you learn as a CEO.
Tell us about this team that you've built around you. You have this wonderful team who have had the privilege of meeting to build PrecisonOS. So tell us about PrecisonOS. What is it? What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah. So it's a cliche, but it all did start in a basement. Colin is one of our co-founders. He's our chief technical officer, brilliant software engineer. And Rob is the other co-founder, also from game development, and our creative officer. And we literally met in Colin's basement because they were transitioning from a different opportunity. I was looking for something new, and we just randomly met. And we met in Colin's basement through some mutual friends, in fact, our spouses. And that's the first time I tried VR. And the first time I put that headset on, Adrian, that was 6 years ago. It was a huge setup, computers, lots of wires. I'd never experienced anything like that in my life before. And I'm not just saying that because we're in it now. It had to be impactful enough that it wasn't an incremental change to what I'd seen before. It was, they use the term disruptive. It was truly something really special and unique. And that's why I went down this pathway. And what we're trying to do with Precision is we really want to offer experiential learning to anybody in the world, because it doesn't matter where you are in the world. Patients and physicians, there's a trusting relationship there. And if the physician doesn't have the experience or hasn't had the skill to do a particular procedure, the patient certainly thinks they do. And so that's our goal with this company.
So you talk about this, the VR being an experiential learning environment. How did you commercialize that?
So we pursued it through medical device companies because one of the things that's very important and relevant in orthopedics is that you learn surgery most of the time with a product. Okay, so if you're doing a knee replacement, you need to have a knee replacement implant there with you, whether it be a shoulder, etc. So there was a combined interest there from what we wanted to teach and what the learner wanted to learn, as well as the medical device company wanted to convey. And so they were the initial and continue to be the initial target for a lot of this software because they're trying to teach all of us about new and innovative ideas. And so that's where we started, and we continue to pursue that avenue. And it just so happened that the residency programs also had interest because we know as residents or previous residents that we don't get a lot of time in the operating room. So how do you facilitate that with something like this, where you can actually go into a system and practice on a virtual patient? It just seems to make sense that it would be important in a residency program. So that's sort of the two pathways we've pursued. And then, of course, since then, some professional societies have become interested in this, like the American Shoulder Elbow Society, who we're collaborating with right now. We've done some work with the American Academy, the American Arthroscopy Association. We're planning to do some stuff with the Pediatric Society, Global Spine. Everybody has an interest in this because the agendas are all aligned. Is how do we train as many people as possible safely so they can perform the best surgery on their patients?
And this is translated actually through a lot of research to actually be now evidence-based, is that correct?
Yeah, so that's where the academic side really kind of translates into this as well, and it's an excellent point, is we've always pursued a level of academia that's relevant to a new technology, which is if you're going to prove that it works, you have to prove that it works. And so we pursued this with actually the Canadian Shoulder Elbow Society, where we did 2 randomized trials comparing VR to some other methods of learning and then assessed them on cadavers. And most recently, so those studies actually were quite compelling in that they show that the trainees actually got better after VR. The most recent publication we had it's a case report, but it's an example of how a resident practiced in the system and then was able to do a case that he had never done before on his own. And so there's a lot of learnings that I think we're picking up from this, is that we work on our 3-dimensional models and we iterate in our brain about what that's going to look like in real life. But now we have a model to actually accelerate that mental model in our brain so we can bring that to the OR. And I feel that that's what happened to that resident in that case report.
Tell us about maybe a couple of the defining moments you've had in your life.
So defining moment for me in medical school was probably, the first one is getting in. I mean, that's big. I mean, if you think about the time and commitment that you have to put in, and it is a commitment. I mean, if anything for me, I would say that working hard is underestimated because it's a natural thing that most people have to do to get in medical school. While in medical school, I think one of the things I really noticed about myself was the skill of observation. And I think really honing in on that to say, you know, that actually looks like X, that actually looks like Y, let's run with that and see if that's actually the case. Residency, again, you know, obviously getting into residency was challenging in the sense that you're competing with some of the best people. And so setting yourself up for that, so thinking ahead, I think, is a really, really important skill, because we need to focus on now, which is important to live in the present, but you have to plan for the future. Planning for the future does require you to talk to as many people who are in the future, or your future, and ask them to reflect on the things that they had to do. And then you take that knowledge and then you work with that. Which can be, this is a form of networking, because effectively networking is talking to people who live in your future. And so I think that's something that you need to pursue on a regular basis. And you know, from a business perspective, there are several things I think that really triggered for me, which is why this is important, is that we're seeing examples of people using the software and actually benefiting from it. So we had a case, for example, of a surgeon in Africa, and we had this picture sent to us. He had never used VR before, but he was practicing for a procedure that he does probably infrequently when he's there, or at least because of, you know, the situation there. So that for me was certainly an important piece of why we're doing what we're doing, is we want to be able to offer this to anybody anywhere in the world, and it's achievable because they don't have, at least in this hospital, it's core, it's basic. And there's a picture of him using VR, which is one of the most high-tech technologies in a low-tech environment. So really, really compelling.
And that must be very satisfying for, you know, your professional and academic aims too. I mean, that's an incredible story.
Yeah, so they really align together.
The last question is that, what 3 pieces of advice would you give somebody who's maybe in your shoes, you know, 10 years ago, or who wants to get or where you are?
So I think humility is a really, really big one, because that resonates in multiple channels. It allows you to listen. It also allows you to pursue opportunities because you have an open mind on things. And that'd be the second thing, is keep an open mind. It's always important to, you know, respect people who have gone through the challenges that you think you might go through. And even the ones that are thinking about going through the challenges, because you can test yourself by offering yourself to people who are learning or want to learn from you. Because effectively, you were pursuing mentors, but you should also be a mentor as part of that. And the last thing I think is to really, you know, find your passion. Because if you're going to do anything and you're going to be good at it, it's very cliche, and I will say it because I truly do believe it, is if you're pursuing your passion, it doesn't really feel like you're working. And that's certainly the 3 pieces of advice I would offer.